Hey, friends, my name's Brian Douglas, and I'm excited to talk to you about release automation. Um, so let's jump right in. Excellent. So, to talk about release automation, I need to first talk about continuous integration, continuous delivery to automatically always deploy your project or your platform really to production. Now, great automation looks like this. You've got a simple setup that you could scale. And this is actually not a scale, it's a treadmill. Uh, but instead of walking downstairs to travel all this wood to the basement, you create an automated process. And that's like the bare bones of automating releases. Now, I previously worked at this company called GitHub, which most of you have heard of. I spent about almost 5 years there, and I worked pretty heavily on talking through the idea of automation through this tool called GitHub Actions. So, GitHub Actions really is a bunch of primitives that GitHub's built over the past, at this point, 15 years today. Uh, Amazing. But these primitives, the API, webhooks, authentication, all built in and bundled into one layer, which is interactive, which is your repository. Now, I was a big fan. I grew up in the 90s and big fan of NBA Jam. And I think what it really comes down to this process is just like in the game of basketball, you have a process to get the ball in the hoop, just like getting wood to the basement. So I always use this like analogy with basketball when doing automation, where on the game of basketball, it is to get the ball in the hoop. And there's one concept or statistics in the game of basketball. There's a book actually came out called Hooponomics, and so the book was called Sprawl Ball, but the idea was called Hooponomics, and it's basically Moneyball applied for basketball. And there was one point in the court where all the majority of the points win. Sorry, the most of the points attempted as field goals win in 30% of the time. So if you knew that 31% of your shots would go in if you got the ball to this point, you would optimize and create play structures to automate yourself to the hoop. Now, automated as in you don't really have to think as an NBA player. NBA players are very smart, but what I'm getting at is you don't have to think about where everyone is at the court when everyone has a job to do. So in this, what we're looking at is, and I'll get into automation in a second, but this is what we're looking at as a triangle offense. For the 1, 2, and 4, it creates a triangle. And so that way, no matter where you are in the court, you always know somebody is in the spot of the most highest percentage shots, which is number 2 here. And the idea is if you know someone's there, or if you know that person's double covered, at least a 5-4 and the 3 will be wide open. So think of that when you think of the concept of automation and getting things shipped continuously and iteratively to get your releases cut. My name's B Dougie is I introduced myself as Brian Douglas, but go by B Dougie on Twitter, B Dougie on GitHub, and I like to say that I'm the Beyonce of open source. I only have 15 minutes, so I can't go into detail on why I call myself that. You'll just have to Google it. And I mentioned earlier GitHub Actions being the feature. Now, I used to work at GitHub, but I've built almost all of my infrastructure and all of my platform, which is open source today, on GitHub Actions. And I'll get into that in detail. So we touched on the workflow automation, but we want to talk about like the different pieces. So to kind of understand how you interact with this one DevOps tool, everything within the idea of GitHub Actions is built inside of a workflow. And these are the workflows as just like playing the game of basketball, you have plays. Well, these plays will be inside of a workflow folder, which is written in YAML. And every single workflow is triggered by webhook events. So any interactivity on GitHub within their webhooks, which is one of the primitives, will trigger an event to start the automated process. Now, workflows include jobs, and we're going to go like, we don't have to go all the way down. This is as deep as I go. But these jobs will go do one piece of the puzzle. Now, these are all the players on the court. This is this sort of mental anecdote analogy that I'm providing for you. So if you know these are jobs and these are events that you do repetitively, you've identified this repetitive task and you automate those. So in the concept of like what we do at Open Source, we identify every time we want to cut a release, we cut a release every single time there's a merge pull request to the main branch. We built that automation structure and everything we use right now today is open source. So you're more than welcome to jump in the code. I can't actually, I'll give you some repos later, but can't actually show every single part because I only have limited time to talk through that. But one of the repos I mentioned inside the open source org is the Explorer. So Explorer is basically a way for users and contributors to get an idea of what the data looks like on our Explore page. So this is our automated process of how we deploy a new version of the new Explore page every time we merge a branch into the main branch. So we start with we build the application. So that's one of our jobs. We also put that into a container. And then we deploy that through releases, bundle it down statically, and then deploy that through GitHub Pages. Actually, so that's our choice and infrastructure for this project. But this is sort of give you like a mental idea of what's happening as far as the release process. Now, all GitHub Actions you can find if you're using any of them, you can find in a tab inside of a GitHub repo. But inside of the code itself, all it is just YAML. I'll show this one briefly, but the YAML here is triggered basically what I mentioned before. Every time there's a merge or a push to the main branch. So going back, pull requests themselves, these events that get merged into the main branch, they trigger the actions that I mentioned before. These actions also trigger an event to the Cloud Runner. So all of GitHub Actions compute is actually hosted in the cloud. You could also self-host this if you like. So there's pathway to host that on your DigitalOceans or your Azure or AWS. I choose to host on my infrastructure with GitHub Actions specifically in their cloud runners because we're doing open source and it's free. And then this is just an example of our logs that we get because we're hosting it. We can see the logs directly when we have our static build that gets hosted up in the cloud. We did actually switch projects here, but this example is our docs page. It still has the same structure as well, also open sourced. So I really quickly wanted to talk through another concept and how we sort of release using artifacts as well. I live stream on Twitch every Tuesday and Friday, and I've built as every live streamer, any sort of live coder on Twitch. The first thing you do is you build a chatbot. It's kind of like building your lightsaber if you're a Jedi. And so I built a chatbot years ago, and I've been updating it on stream a lot of times when I fixing stuff while I'm still live streaming and showing other stuff. But what I'm getting at is there's this one tool, my original chatbot is called Slaybot, which is actually it wasn't the original. My original was called Baybot. But Slaybot is like Baybot, but it slays is literally the tagline I have in there. And the idea is every time I make a change on stream, I actually upload a bundled version of the Slaybot up into the cloud or into a GitHub artifact. Now, this is what our sort of build release pipeline looks like. So I actually have a check to say if this is just a pull request or a sort of preview or staging environment, I will build pull request into a staging environment. But if it gets merged into the main branch, I will build that to production. And that's what this little fork in the road looks like. Now, we deploy these GitHub packages also using GitHub Actions. I know this is like really a GitHub heavy way to automate release, but the beauty of this is it's all built in, especially if you're using open source code for your platform. This is what it looks like for our GitHub package. It's also going to be available in the packages tab. And the one thing I did want to mention is the option to generate release notes. So this is the one thing that I wanted to spend a little more time in and take some time to really explain. Release notes is like it's the bread and butter for really understanding and sharing communication around what's happened previously in your project. So for that reason, every time a release is cut in open source, we generate a change log through automation through these GitHub Actions, and we do that purposely so that way there's a sort of breadcrumb for folks to understand what happened prior or the sort of prior art, what's happened in our project. Now, when you cut a release, you go to this tab where you generate a release. So if you haven't done this, there's a lot of documentation around this on GitHub. But you generate a release inside your repository, and there's like this new little flag here. And currently, it's actually in the bottom right over here that auto generates release notes. Now, I point this out because we automate our version but I did want to point out that you could do this yourself automatically. So automatically add all the markdown for merge pull requests and the diff. So what this means is every single change that happened from the current tag, which in the concept, I think a lot of folks use Git these days, but the concept of Git, you have tags between today's tag that you're creating and the previous tag. You can show all changes through commit history and then generate that markdown. It's once you really think about how programmatically Git sets everything up for you to be successful, you kind of understand how this is actually, you can automate this pretty easily. And this is what the output looks like. Here we got some markdown that kind of shows the first commit. It's sort of cut off a bit, but you can see Sam has a commit to the docs. Below there, we've actually got, I'm sort of blocking it, so apologies, but below there we've got the docs for all new contributors, which is exceptional. Um, but I want to point out, not only can you do this just clicking a button inside of release tab, you can also do this specifically automating in your YAML or your workflow. So specifically, and I'm cutting this off again, but it just says generate release notes and then flag true. What this is doing is actually running some automation using the GitHub API. And now, reminder, the GitHub API is one of the other primitives of the GitHub Actions that is provided by GitHub. And you don't have to set up the API manually or anything like that or pass any tokens. You get a free token, and I say free token. Nothing in this world is free, but what I'm getting at is that you get a GitHub token that you can leverage out of the box. As long as you're leveraging that up in the line above my head, you can then also turn the flag on to generate release notes every time you cut a release or publish to the main branch. And that's our workflow. This actually, ultimately, what's the beauty of this is when you cut releases on GitHub, you get distribution of your project to everyone who's following you as a developer or you as a organization. So organization is open source, 100% open source. This is how we do announce features is through our releases. And we have a lot of folks, about 300 people who are following specifically just the code of our project as well. So I bring that up because if you're looking to take action, we've actually got actions just like these in open source. They're all public and open source. You're more than welcome to go through and discover how we leverage actions in our project. Again, open source is open source. So like we're more than happy to get feedback, open issue, or ping me and have a conversation. I also wanted to point out that one of the projects that we actually created a couple years ago, which is hotopensauce.pizza. It's a free and open source project that we do together with a bunch of community members for discovering up and coming open source projects. Now, all the data that we source to get up and coming open source projects is actually powered by the previous repo, which is the Actions repo that populates this list of up and coming projects. So it gives you the ability to upvote and source ideas for projects that are looking for open source contributors. So sharing that in case you have any interest. Also sharing the fact that I mentioned open source a few times. Check it out if you're interested and if you're an enterprise that is looking to get involved in open source or looking for contributors or a growing community. Maybe you want to do a hackathon. That's what we do. So we'd love to have a conversation about that. And as a reminder, I'm the Beyonce of open source. Again, no time to talk through that, but definitely Google it if you're interested. And you can find me on Twitter if you want to chat about more things about releases and automating things throughout your platform. So appreciate your time. And a reminder to shut up and jam.